everyone. Just wanted to introduce you to our Goathouse YouTube channel. This is our introductory video, where here I'm going to tell you exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it. So at Goathouse here, we actually did start our own church. As you can see, the stained glass windows behind me. It's located in the little town of Hamburg, Pennsylvania. And yeah, it's been going very good. But of course, we look very different from the typical church. And that's why I'm making this video, so that you understand why that is the case and why we call ourselves Goathouse as well. So we'll first start off with the name Goathouse. Where did we get it from? So honestly, this started about a decade ago when we first bought a property that we live in currently. When we bought this place, there was a shed located in the outskirts there. It was a sizable shed. And it had writing on the side of it that in French it said the house of the goat. And as we kind of dug into this a little bit more with the old owner who lived there, he kind of expressed to us this story how at one point him and his mom didn't get along, and he was banished basically out to live in that shed rather than living in the house. And what happened was the mom went out and wrote this on the side of the building, the house of the goat, basically mocking him for being out there. So it was a terrible story. But what was interesting with it is that the man that lived in there, who lived in our house, we actually became very good friends with, and he was such an incredible person that we realized that by him being out there, and in the goat house is what we deemed its name, he came to a spiritual reality within himself and became a very spiritual, solid individual who we just absolutely fell in love with. So we could not help but to see that building almost in the same way that we would look at the crucifix itself, because it's something that has such a negative connection, but then something good came out of it. So the whole theme that was formed out of that is basically how God makes beauty for ashes, or how good things come out of those things that are made, things that are made for bad, good can come out of that. So that was kind of the foundation. And we knew that we wanted to do some form of ministry that had to correlate with that. And the name Goathouse, which was deemed to this building, stuck with us the entire time. So that is kind of the fundamental reason as to why that name came to be, as off-putting as it seems. So there is a very good story that it birthed out of, let's say. So one thing though, as we were moving along in our journey, is that we realized that when you get to the story in Leviticus, it actually talks about the scapegoat, which is, you can kind of see being the story here with our friend being banished out into the shed, right? Because what happens is, in the story of the scapegoat, is that for the atonement to God, back then what they did is they took a sacrificial goat and they would drape it with all of their sins symbolically, and they would chase that goat off into the wilderness for it to carry their sins away, and just basically die and carry it off out from their village. And then they were atoned back to God, right? And so in some sense, this was sort of like the story with our friend, where the representation, or the relationship between the two of them, it was sort of draped over him in a negative way. He was shunned off into the shed, so he kind of became the scapegoat there. He was the problem. He was the trouble. And what we realize is that there's so many of us that carry this same story, not maybe as dramatic as what we see there, but yet in less dramatic ways. And in particular, I sort of realized this about even myself when it came to other Christians that were in my life. See, I used to be an atheist, so I am the kind of person who had to think about what things mean, right? And in our Christian world today, it's really kind of about believing more than thinking. So because I was always a slight bit different on that, it was harder for me to believe, let's say. Um, I feel like I had faced a lot of adversity from my Christian fellows because of that, and in some ways I became kind of a scapegoat myself, for in accordance with them. So I see that within myself. I see that within many other people also in this world, and I see how a lot of people, especially people who are more on the spiritual side of things, have ventured away from the church, have ventured away from the institutions, and seeking spirituality elsewhere because we have lost our trust in those institutions. And oftentimes it's because of a misunderstood, I think, projection that we have with each other. And those people sort of become the scapegoats, and they end up ventured away from the church, or they venture away from their families because there is a miscommunication, and a lot of us have gone off, and we have ventured into other spiritual avenues because we don't trust the church. We don't trust the people that are in the church because maybe we've had bad interactions with those people, lots of judgments, so on and so forth, and all of that, right? So, with that being said, there too, we see how the idea of our church being Goathouse fits in with that narrative as well, because ultimately, what we are trying to do here is to provide a space that does allow the people who have ventured away from those institutions and into other avenues of spirituality and faith to still come into a centralized space, like the beauty that a church allows for, and to be a community of people where this is more of a neutral space so that they can venture to explore their own spirituality, and we can kind of work amongst each other to kind of flesh out what that journey is with each other and what the scripture actually has to say about all of that, right? So that's kind of that's also fits in with the name here, ironically, and to what we're actually trying to do within this ministry. So one of the things in my journey that I had noticed is that the challenge that we face is when we look at scripture today, we are very far removed from the way that our ancient ancestors or even the early church fathers had understood the scripture. I think we look at all the biblical stories at face value, rather than trying to understand what the meaning is that underlies the stories themselves. And what I want to do, or what we are doing here at this church, is we're going back into the way in which the ancient people understood how they wrote it and how they read the scripture, to kind of bring forth the true meaning of what that scripture is trying to reveal to us. And in my way of doing that, what I had done is put a large focus on understanding symbology, because it is the symbolism within the scripture itself that still holds a lot of that meaning within it. And if you really want to understand what these scriptures are telling us, I have found that it's just undoubtedly and very obvious that once you start to look at it from the symbolic perspective, it begins to truly unfold itself to you in incredible ways. So that's also what we're trying to do here. So for instance, I think that the way that we as the Christian church today has approached, like, let's say the story of Christ, for instance, we approach Christ only from, let's say, the death and resurrection. So we kind of look at Christ only on that face value, right? Which is almost a pragmatic or almost a materialistic kind of understanding. Whereas we can also think of Christ as not just that, but he is also what? He is also the way, the truth, and the life, correct? So if you think about it, each one of those things, the way, the truth, and the life, are in themselves mountains of understanding, okay? There's so much held within each one of those categories. But rather than really kind of pulling each of those apart, we sort of really look at that. We only focus on the death and resurrection of Christ as salvation. So we're really only looking at it from face value. Okay, so I know that that sounds very different than what we how we typically approach here the Christian faith from the church aspect, and I understand that. But if I can explain, you can get there, or you can understand Christ either by believing in that, in the faith, in the death and the resurrection, and you can get that from believing that, and some people can. So it's in some sense, by that belief alone, it's almost as if you can like sit on top of a mountain, right, without having to really understand much that underlies that. But there are some that have to, like myself, had to think their way up that mountain, right? Have to think their way into understanding what that really means on not such a surface level pragmatic sense, but more of a technical sense. And how you do that is by breaking down the way and the truth and the life. So if you can understand what the way actually means, like what is the way? It's like, well, the world is full of all kinds of information, multiple ideas. It's like a whole maze of different ways in which to go, right? So understanding the way is sort of cutting through the weeds and discovering what is truth, right? Because once you start cutting out all of the things that are confusing and leading this way and that, you start to find truth. So then that's the second part. So then you come to truth. But then you can also understand what truth is. Like, well, what is truth? Well, start cutting away certain things and you sort of find truth hidden there. And then when you find truth, suddenly there, it's like we can live amongst each other civilly, within peace, even within our own inner selves. And then that's when life flourishes. So you see how these three parts kind of lead to the way, the truth, and the life, lead to the top of that mountain, where we can feel a sense of being saved, or a returning back into paradise, because paradise is where everything is at peace and harmony with one another. Well, both of those avenues can take you there. So it's just that one is more centralized on the idea of belief, and the other one is more centralized on the idea of thinking your way or working your way up the mountain, rather than just kind of being able to float and sit up there. So we are giving a space here that to produce understanding, to give a way of working your way up that mountain. And we're delving deeper into the scripture, going below face value and understanding it on that symbolic level, where you can really kind of see all of the parts and all of what the symbology is trying to reveal to you in much, much deeper ways, right? So you can also think of it this way. The Bible actually tries to point this out, because if we can think back to the book of Exodus and we think about Moses going up Mount Sinai, he first is given the law in what? Stone tablets, right? So stone tablets is something that's obviously hard. It wouldn't be so easily to take into oneself, right? But then the stone, later presented by Christ, the law, becomes flesh. So now it's like becoming, something that's a little bit softer. And then even later becomes spirit, is turned into spirit in the book of Acts. So you can see through the story, through the biblical story, that here in itself is trying to show you that God, which is represented by the law, is actually being softened in a way that I like to think of it as being digestible, because that's kind of what the Last Supper is all about. It's about what the bread and the wine is really representing as Christ's body. But what is that? It's the taking in or ingesting in Christ himself, or God himself, or the law itself, moving it from stone into something that it's more personal, Okay, so understanding, if you think about it, also is a personal journey. It's a way in which we bring that substance of God into ourselves in a personal way, and we can build ourselves up from that. So that's another way of looking at this as well. So we're moving from stone basically to spirit, basically from something that's hard to digest into something that is digestible. And interestingly enough, for those who have a challenge with just simply believing in something, when we as the church had often come saying, you have to believe in the death and resurrection of Christ for salvation, basically what you're doing is you're handing them, any person that might, like myself, that would have to think their way through or try to understand something, you're basically handing them a giant stone, because it's not something that they're going to be able to just take and ingest. It's just someone who has a hard time believing. It's just not going to be able to click their fingers and believe, right? They have to kind of come to a particular understanding, and then all of a sudden, boom, click, they get it, right? So what's interesting here is that because we've only taken that approach, it is tricky, because what you can do is you can actually turn Christ into an idol god by doing this. And what do I mean by that? Because we oftentimes think that an idol god is an untrue God. But really, if you're not understanding all of that which underlies Christ, right, like the way, the truth, and the life, if you don't really break that apart and understand it, and you're only taking one concept that's at the top, you can kind of form that into any which way you want. And in some sense, what it does is, I'm not trying to say anyone's doing this on purpose or in particular, but it makes it very easy for us to create Christ in whatever way in which we want to create him to be, which would then essentially create him into an idol god as well. So part of what I'm trying to do is also to try to bring us away from the dangers of doing that, and into a more solidified understanding of what the Christian story is actually trying to show us, right? So kind of what you see here, I know that we look a bit different, and that is on purpose, because in some sense, we are kind of allowing for a space of understanding for people to come in. It's more of a neutral space, or a space that you could say is kind of on the fringes a little bit. So in some sense, we are sort of what I would like to call decentralizing, okay? And one way to look at that is, if we think about John the Baptist, right? You saw the story of John the Baptist in the Bible, and you did not see him connecting with people in the temple. He was somebody who specifically represented the outside, or the wilderness. He lived out in the wilderness. He wore animal skins. He ate locusts. He did all kinds of weird things, right? And why is that the case? Because he was supposed to be representative of what's on the outside, or what's on the fringes, or what's in the wilderness, right? And because there has been so many of us that could not just accept or understand the Christian belief, because we struggle with belief in itself, we've strayed away from that central story. We've moved out into the wilderness, and we're trying to find our own way, because we haven't really had any good people to guide us in any helpful or personal way. So yeah, we actually look different in the sense, because we are taking, I think, the form of John the Baptist in the way in which we are going out decentralizing, and we are going out into the wilderness, where right now there is all different kinds of spiritual avenues, and we're trying to weave that golden thread between all of those outer avenues and bring it back together, that we can just have a unity together and understanding together. That's not to say that any one person has to give something of themselves up. It's a way of coming together for that inner journey, in that togetherness, to find our way back to God, right? Or back into paradise. So that's why we take on a little bit of a different look, because essentially that's kind of what we're doing. And if you think about it, the goat also fits within that category as well, because unlike the sheep that kind of stays close to the flock, right? The goat was always the animal that would wander around with curiosity, get itself in trouble, and go, wandering off into the wilderness. So, essentially that's kind of what we see ourselves as. We are those who aren't so quick to gather with the flock, just simply because the flock calls us to that. But we have to have our personal journeys to understand and to get there. We can't just sit on that mountaintop. We have to climb, and goats are pretty good at climbing. So that is also what, that's another part of why we call ourselves what we call ourselves, and another part of why we have a little bit of an edgy look to us, because I feel like we are kind of doing the John the Baptist thing as well. So the idea here is to build bridges, is to build unity, is to weave the golden thread between us in a world right now that is kind of topsy-turvy all over the place, and there's plenty of confusion to go around, right? So that is the centralized idea of what we're doing. And what you're going to see in the sermons in which I post, you're going to see me bringing about the story of Scripture in a very symbolic way, and also trying to use what the Scripture's saying, or how it's defined symbolically, mixing it with a lot of what we understand today within our own human psychology and our own human condition. So it's a way of bringing these things together, these truths together, in a way that really can connect and make sense with our understanding, with our human condition, with our human psychology, and making these stories, these old narratives, way more sense than what they had made in the past. And I think that by the end of it, it's going to be pretty hard to argue what a lot of these stories are trying to show us. And even for many traditional Christians that have not looked at Scripture in this way, I think you're going to be very, very surprised at what the Scripture is actually saying, and probably encouraged by it as well, because it is a beautiful story. And yeah, I think that what we're trying to do here is going to bring a much higher appreciation for these ancient stories, to show that there's real power and significance behind them, some real meaning that really brings sustenance to life, and really calls us into a mystical journey. And that's what we want to bring back, also that kind of mystical feel again to the Scripture itself. So that's what we're going to be doing. And yeah, we hope that you guys follow along with us. Give us your posts. Any kind of arguments is welcome. Any kind of compliments, of course, are also welcome. But I'm going to do my best at this. And yeah, I'm looking forward to having you guys along for the journey. So thank you. But that's us, Goathouse.